Welcome to Inside the Vault, Enterprise Bank's podcast series where we talk about items of interest to the small business community. We've heard some great entrepreneurial stories in the last few episodes of Inside the Vault, but today we want to diverge a little bit away from those fun and interesting stories to talk about some serious issues that have arisen in the fraud landscape around check fraud. With me today is Chuck Leyh, our president and CEO, regular participant in the Inside the Vault podcast. Thanks, Chuck, for making time again.
Good afternoon.
So let me kind of set the stage here, and then we'll talk about more specifically what's happening with check fraud in today's world. So to give our viewers and listeners kind of an idea of the scope of this issue. And again, government statistics and other statistics often lag, so don't have anything totally up to date. But in the most recent year where they've collected the data in 2022, there were actually 680,000 reports of check fraud in the banking system. And that is double what was reported in 2021. So considering that trend and what we're seeing anecdotally here at Enterprise, and Chuck, you can talk about that, we're in 2024. So, we most likely are probably over 1 billion transactions nationally that have been subject to some type of check fraud. And, these are not small dollars that we're talking about. In that most recent year, 2022, check fraud losses were estimated at $24 billion. So when you extrapolate that out too, we're getting into some huge numbers. And this has become a major concern for the banking industry as a whole, but it needs to be a major concern for business owners. So what we're talking about here is everyone, business owners, bankers, everyone was nervous when we started, predominantly switching to electronic payment processing. And the technology is caught up in a lot of cases to kind of mitigate some of the fraud around electronic payments. What the fraudsters have realized is if you go back to the old standard paper check, there was ways to exploit that system as well. And there are, obviously vast differences between the protections provided in a lot of areas of banking, including this area, for consumers that aren't necessarily afforded to business owners. So, our job here today and on an ongoing basis is to try to educate our business owner clients about ways that they can mitigate some of these risks and keep themselves from losing a lot of money related to this check fraud issue. So even some simple things that were being employed to try to mitigate this check fraud, when the issue started to emerge several years ago with the sophistication of fraudsters on all different fronts, was we told everybody, all right, make sure that you drop your check at the post office or in a post office box in your neighborhood. Well, now we're finding out that the U.S. Postal Service itself has been compromised. Again, dated statistics, but in 2021, there were actually almost 300,000 reports of theft from post office boxes that were used to fraudulently defraud consumers and business owners out of funds. And that's a 161% increase over the year before. So suffice it to say, with all areas of fraud, the fraudsters become more and more sophisticated, and it's up to the consumers, the business owners, and the banks to up their game on a continual basis to try to stay one step ahead of the fraudsters and mitigate, what could be huge losses to a bank and to a business owner. So, Chuck, we're going to talk here in a minute about some of what Enterprise Bank specifically is doing to mitigate these issues. But you, as the bank CEO, Even in our little world, as a small community business-oriented bank, what types of things have we seen along these lines?
Well, the major thing is getting a hold of the check and changing who it's paid to or the amounts, and then having them flow through the system. A lot of these things are originating, and people are like, oh, the fraudsters are becoming more and have a greater ingenuity as to how to pull these things off. But the truth of the matter is, it's us changing the system that's created the opportunity for fraudsters to get away with things. Because if you look at what I call the
When you say us, I think I'm going to kind of preempt you and say what we're being forced by the government to do.
yeah, yeah, I mean, when I say us, I mean
Yeah.
us as a civilization. But it's right. A few years, not that many years ago, some politicians that need to go unnamed decided that banks didn't give you access to your money because they were making money on your money. Well, the truth of the matter is, in the banking system, it takes time to transfer funds from one institution to another, especially when it's checks. I mean, physically, the check has to go from the vendor into that bank, and then into the Federal Reserve, and then from the Federal Reserve to the other bank. And that takes days, 2-3 days to go through the process. Well, prior to congressional people getting involved and mischaracterizing what goes on in the industry, banks would basically wait a day or 2 or 3, depending upon where the check was coming from, and wait to give you access to those funds until the funds actually got to the bank.
They didn't even have the bank.
Yeah, the bank really doesn't have, the day that somebody cashes a check, it didn't, or deposits a check, it doesn't come into your account immediately. It takes time for that to happen when you're working with checks. And so banks had set up a system whereby they would delay you having access to the funds until it cleared, it truly cleared. And that could be, like I say, 1, 2, 3 days. Then the political environment decided to get involved and mischaracterize, because everybody wants to beat up on banks and say, hey, you got your deposit yesterday and you're holding on to the funds for days on end, sometimes 3 days, and you're making money and all that float. Well, the truth is the monies weren't there yet. And the way you didn't give people access because they hadn't come into your account. And there are rules that say you can pull a check back. If somebody sees it's an error, they can actually, something went wrong, they can actually wait a period of time, up to a period of time, and ask for it back. So all those rules were considered when they made funds accessible to people. Well, then when the government gets involved and say you have to have next day availability of the funds. Well, the truth of the matter is the funds aren't in your house the next day, but you're giving it away anyways. So if somebody comes back in and says, hey, that was a bad deposit to begin with, after those funds are already taken out the next day, that's that timing difference that allows fraudsters to be successful. Because before, the funds wouldn't have left by the time the fraud got identified, so nobody would get a benefit of trying. Now, by making it be the next day and creating an environment where the timing is such that the funds may not have cleared the bank or be vested in the bank, meaning they can't be pulled back by the way our systems are set up, well, by doing that, you open the door for fraud to take place. Had you not let the funds get out and would have caught the mistakes before that time period, then there was no fraud, because nobody could get away with it because the funds hadn't left. And there's all sorts of frauds that have grown from this. I mean, this fundamental change in the concept has just been incredible at funding terrorism and foreign governments doing things that aren't appropriate. And none of us in this country seem to recognize or take responsibility for it. But the truth of the matter is, there are tons of frauds that work on that system where you have next day availability of the funds when those funds truly aren't vested in your institution, and that's how they get
Yeah.
that's how they steal money.
Well, before, all these techniques the fraudsters are using today, which we'll talk about, we always had to deal with check kiting
Yep.
concern. And that's where somebody deposits funds that aren't really there from another bank and then pulls it out before that money's truly in the paying bank's house. But now we've morphed into an even more difficult environment for the political and governmental reasons you talked about. But now we have things happening on the with the advent of technology to the fraudsters' advantage. So it used to be, check forgery was the big issue. Somebody that wasn't authorized to sign would sign a check. Well, now they're changing the payees. They're smart enough not to change necessarily in all cases the amount of the check or even the check number, but they're changing who it gets paid to.
Right. And in the old days, the frauds were recreate the check and recreate the signature. And we all put systems in place to try to pick up on those by having the client signature and matching up the signatures that were coming in on the checks with the ones that were on file. And that cut a lot of issues. But like I say, that timing issue, if you look in the system and the system says, hey, if you make a deposit, the depositor has 2 days to pull those funds back because they say it was a bad, somebody did something fraudulent. So if you have 2 days to pull it back, but you have to release the funds in the next day,
simple math.
That's what creates the issue. But on the other hand, in the old days, when you said, hey, I'm going to wait 3 days to give you your money, and you had 2 days to pull it back, well, then that would never happen, because once the period lapsed that you couldn't pull the funds back and say it was an error, then you let the monies go on the third day. Well, then they were good monies. And it wasn't something where this timing issue could take place. And, it's funny, you open the door for these things, and yet all these people beat their chests about how wonderful they are that now the consumer has their money the next day. And yet the truth is they've played a huge role in funding all the terrorism in this world that's going on from this fraud. It's to me, it's disgusting.
And the other thing that's happening, again, because of technology and the sophistication of desktop publishing software, fraudsters can basically create, if they can get a hold of your check, they can create check stock fonts to look exactly like a bank check.
Oh, absolutely. The AI today and the things that are in place and the remote deposit. So actually the actual check never comes back again. An image of the checks comes back, and you can create whatever image you want nowadays. So the bottom line is what we're migrating to is systems that the person that drafts the check communicates the information to the bank, and then the bank has to match the checks coming in with that information. And if they don't match, then they return it. They say, we're not accepting it. And that's in effect where everybody's migrating to in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Because it's the only way to correct yourself. But on the other hand, I hear, again, the politicians that came up with the let's give you next day availability funds, now they're saying, well, it's the bank's fault that this fraud is taking place, and they should be paying for all of it. Well, there's a wonderful idea. When you think about it, the bank, how would your clients operate if the bank said, no, you can't take your money out? It doesn't. We make your funds available as soon as they're vested, or the way the law is now, even before they're vested. Well, when you have to have a communication process, which is the only way to say, here's the checks that I wrote.
Because there's more than one institution.
Yeah. So you match them up and make sure they agree. Well, if the borrower, the client in this case, the person who writes the checks, doesn't want to communicate with you, how could a bank protect itself to make sure it's the right information that's clearing in the account? And yet you have a politician say, well, it's the bank's fault, they should be responsible. this stuff, this concept politically that banks print money is ridiculous. And, they're a business like anybody else. These losses hurt. Banks go out of business from this happening. And yet nobody wants to take responsibility. Just beat up on the banks because they print money. And the truth is they don't.
It's just like, we had a discussions previously on the podcast about cybersecurity overall. And we get a lot of pushback from customers on the mechanisms and policies that we have in place to mitigate the risk to them and to the bank around cybersecurity. Same thing with this. You know where it's different, though? You know this better than I do. When somebody's actually been a subject of one of these issues and lost funds. I was at a networking event 2 nights ago, and somebody asked me about what the next podcast episode was, and I explained what we're doing here today. And in that group of 5 people, of business owners, 3 of them have lost money to check fraud.
Yep.
And they're like, we want to know what we can do to mitigate this from happening in the future. But the ones that have never had the problem, in a lot of cases, unfortunately, see it as a pain in the butt.
Well, and it truthfully is.
Yeah.
When it's common sense tells you, and everybody's moving nowadays that you should be able to transfer funds immediately. And yeah, that's great, except it opens the door for all this type of fraud to take place. And is that really worth it? Are things that much more efficient today than they were 15 years ago before we changed these rules? In some ways, the answer is yeah, it is more efficient. And in some ways, it has opened the door for a lot of bad things to take place. Because, and as you well know, we some of the frauds, we as a bank have done some things that were unique.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Long time ago when we started to have some of these electronic frauds where people were hacking into the system and wiring out monies or ACHing. And as you know, we always put a human link in between. There's no just straight, the computer initiates it and does it. You may get a message from our system that says, I want to do a wire, but it still comes to a human being. And in our house, we call somebody back and say, did you initiate this? And it's amazing how much fraud we have stopped by doing that. But no matter what we do, somebody tries to find a way around it. Traditionally, somebody tried to wire monies out, got a hold of the client's credentials and security measures and initiated a wire. Well, when we called back, that stopped it because the person said, no, I didn't initiate that wire. But
now it's gone further than that.
Yeah, well, once the fraudsters got word that we were doing phone calls, and a lot of banks now do this and have kind of followed suit from what we've done. Now they're trying to, when they send the message that says send a wire, then it's like, oh, by the way, I'm sick. Call me at this number. Do this, do that, and they try to find ways to circumvent the system. And that's why when we set up the system, we don't go along with those things. We basically go to the client and say, here's the protocol. This is a protocol that won't be defeated, and we're not deviating from it. I had one client say, this is inconvenient. Why don't I email you the instructions that I initiated these things? And I'm like, you do realize that the way this happens is they hack your system, get into your system, and initiate the wire. Or if they're in their system, you probably came through your what? Email system.
Yeah.
So they'll be able to email us the message. So why would you ask me to do something like that? And it's just, when we first put that rule in place,
a lot of customer
complained. And then we showed them how much fraud was going on and what took place. And then those same people are sitting there talking to people saying, you should go to this bank because they protect us this way. Yeah. So there's no question it's an inconvenience, but it's with many of these savings ideas, but it's the real world the way it is. As long as you have this mistiming that says funds can leave before you're sure those funds are good, you're going to have fraud. And from the electronics perspective, off of that. Now, with the checks, that's a whole different ballgame. Now, with artificial intelligence and ability and basically the image of the check is what flows through the system now, not the actual check itself. Well, anybody can create anything. My picture can look like something on somebody else's body. This can be changed. I mean, you don't know whether it's bad or good. There's a time when you could tell somebody manipulated an image, but not nowadays.
Right.
Today, they're way too sophisticated and too good at programs that they create tremendously images that are just so good that they look like the original.
Yeah. So let's talk about kind of the latest and greatest evolution in this check fraud situation, which is what's called check washing, which we've alluded to, which, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the banking system and the individual banks have been trying to keep up and playing cat and mouse with the fraudsters. So a lot of banks implemented or have implemented, as have we, available options for the client like positive pay. So positive pay was a way to catch fraud where, a client would send a record or a file of their check numbers and their amounts and their dates. And that would be matched up by the bank to what was actually clearing. Well, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, under check washing, the fraudsters have gotten sophisticated and smart enough to know these systems are in place. But what do those systems not capture? The payee. So that's been the latest evolution, is changing the payees by basically washing or providing a fraudulent check that'll match into those systems, but the payees are different. So we've come up with, and remember, we're subject to the federal banking system and all of its solutions, which don't necessarily come to market as quickly as private do. So we've also developed some interim mitigation around that until the Fed payment system gets updated, right, Chuck?
Yeah, we and our software vendors have discussed creating automatic ways to read the payee and do things like that, and actually have scheduled to implement those types of things towards the latter part of the year. But from our perspective, it was like, I can't wait till the end of the year. There's too much of this going on. So we've actually done some testing and are implementing now this month that, you basically transmit the payee information to us along with the check number and the amount. And then we verify that that's what's clearing the account. And if it's not the same thing, then we don't let it clear the account. Now that takes time and effort. And that's, again, you look at what your options are. In many cases, people have chosen to do something like this and will take the time and go through the expense, because there is an expense. When you send us this list of names and we have to match every single one
manpower,
it takes time to do that, and there's a fee for doing that. You can eliminate all that by getting away from writing checks and doing ACHs. And some people are starting to do that. They're getting rid of the checks, and that's why I get a kick out of, when it came out that there was a lot of check fraud in especially in the Baltimore post office where they found it. And you think, here's a government business that until the last 20 years had a monopoly and now is struggling to make a profit. And what are they doing?
Colluding.
allowing this type of thing to happen, which will cause people to do what? Use the mail less, when what they need is people to use the mail more so that they can make more revenue.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have thought that this is something that, the Postal Service itself was really the last bastion of security, because typically the old days, the security in a postal facility was second to none. And obviously now people found ways around that too. Because a lot of this we saw, people started to steal the mailbox keys from the postman, and then they were going through the mail and doing this type of thing. So we figured, okay, we should advise all our clients, don't use the mailbox, go right to the postal service because the security's there that won't happen. And then boom, it comes out that if you're in Baltimore, it happens. So I don't know. This is a tough situation for everybody. And it's a shame. You see political changes who misrepresent what's really going on in the industry cause an issue, and then they haven't thought through what kind of fraud does that open up. And then and today, even when it is identified, then people will never recognize and admit they made a mistake, which means we don't all get together and work as a team to fix the mistake. We just pass the blame on somebody else. As long as this keeps continuing this way, it's not going to improve. It's going to get worse and worse.
Right. So, there's always the human element too involved in these fraudulent activities. And what I think a lot of business owners or consumers don't think about is they're always thinking, well, the fraudster stealing the mail from the post office, or getting access to a check. A lot of this comes down to insider fraud. So some of the biggest fraud cases have been, internal employees doing these things. One, because they have access to the check stock, if that's not secured. Two, they understand the inner workings of, who's writing checks versus who's reviewing the bank statements or the online activity. So, I wanted to, kind of wrap up here a little bit, and I'd like your comments on some tips that I found after, researching the topic. So the biggest thing, and this is just good business management, not just a fraud detection, consumers and business owners should be reviewing their bank statements on a timely basis and in detail. And even more so than that, we have a pretty sophisticated online banking system, as most banks do. You got to look at it on an ongoing basis. You got to see what's being debited to your account. Does it make sense? Even if you're not using one of these, formal fraud detection tools or one of the programs that we're offering, you got to know what's going on in your account, particularly nowadays with all this fraud. Separating check issuance from review of the statements or the online banking, because, somebody's responsible for the whole ball of wax and they're not the owner. You could have an insider issue on. Don't leave blank. These are some simple things. Don't leave blank spaces on your checks or places where a way that makes it easy for somebody to wash it or change the payee or change any of the information. Pretty simple. Use non-erasable gel ink when you're writing out checks. I've actually seen checks in pencil before.
Well, that's a big thing. But with the washing techniques that are out there, almost any ink can be washed. There was a time when what you said would work, but the sophistication nowadays of being able to reproduce the image of the check on stock and make it look like it was the original check. A lot of these things that used to protect us don't anymore because technology's just grown so much that it circumvents a lot of the processes that we put in place.
Another important one, I think, is you got to safeguard your unused checks. Because if someone can grab the check stock and the blank checks, they have a step ahead in the fraud game. Here's an important one. Vet the employees that are going to be handling checks for your company. Just like when you're hiring, you're vetting an employee, from a character perspective for your operations, you should be from the financial risk perspective. They make anti-fraud check stock now. That's not impossible, but more difficult to replicate with watermarks or images. When they're scanned or images, they'll show that they're true or original. A lot of this electronic check processing we talked about. If you leave an electronically processed check and you don't mark it up as being electronically processed, somebody can double deposit it at another bank. That's a common fraud tool. Keep your addresses up to date for the vendors and people you're sending checks to. A lot of fraudsters intercept mail that was sent to a wrong address or an old address, and they get a copy of the check that way, and then they can wash it or defraud it. As you mentioned, Chuck, consider using bill pay services or ACHs. Um, bring checks to the post office themselves, and hope your local post office is on the up and up. Use opaque or nondescript envelopes for your checks that don't say check enclosed or don't, have information on them that would tell a fraudster there's something that they could get inside to potentially commit a fraud. Anything else you think of, Chuck?
No, I think we've pretty much covered things.
Yeah. But our most important message today, folks, is, you know, this is not just a bank issue. This is an issue for you all as consumers and business owners too, particularly on the business side, because there's much more liability to you than there is to the banks in the commercial realm versus the consumer realm. So we're trying to provide the tools to help mitigate some of this, but it's going to be continuing evolution, and everybody needs to stay vigilant, not just at the bank, but at your particular place of business. Parting comments?
No, I just kind of hope, again, that everybody starts to work together to work through these issues. The normal person has no idea how large the fraud number is and how much of it funds terrorism and governments that we've shut off and that are not good people. We have really opened the door to fund those operations, and we need to work together as a team to stop it.
Great parting comment. For those of you that have any ideas for future topics or any questions, you can email us at insidethevault@enterprisebankpgh.com. You can check us out in audio format on all the major podcast platforms and in video format on YouTube. Thank you for watching or listening.